Hey everyone, buckle up because today we're diving into something that might just turn your whole idea of learning upside down. We're talking differential learning.
Yeah, this is going to challenge some of those old school ideas about practice makes perfect.
For sure. And our guide is a fascinating interview with the guy who basically invented this whole method, Professor Dr. Wolfgang Schulhorn.
Yeah, from that 𝗏𝗏 Academy YouTube channel, right?
Exactly. His insights are mind-blowing. We're going to be looking at how this applies to everything from sports to music, even meditation.
It's pretty wild stuff. So the basic idea, right, is that instead of drilling the same exact movement over and over, you actually learn better by adding variations.
Okay, now that sounds kind of counterintuitive at first. Most people would say consistency is key. So how does that actually work? Break it down for us.
Well, think about it like this. When a baby's learning to walk, they don't just try to take the same perfect step every time, do they?
I guess not. There's a lot of wobbling and experimenting going on.
Exactly. All those little variations are actually giving them the feedback they need to refine their movements and eventually, walk.
So it's like built-in experimentation. They're almost intuitively using differential learning without even realizing it.
Exactly. And Professor Schulhorn takes it even further. He compares it to how artificial neural networks learn. Those AI systems that are based on the human brain.
I've heard of those, yeah. They're getting pretty good at all sorts of things these days.
Well, they learn best when they're fed data that has some noise or variation in it. It's like our brains are actually wired to learn better from change, not just repetition.
That's fascinating. So are you saying those little imperfections and variations we make are actually helping our brains figure things out more effectively?
That's exactly what the research suggests. Here's a crazy stat for you. Our gait patterns, just the way we walk, they've changed by like 85% in just 30 minutes.
Wait, so even when we think we're walking the same way, our bodies are making tons of tiny adjustments?
All the time. And it's not a bad thing at all. This natural variability actually makes us more adaptable learners. It's like, think of it like sailing, constantly adjusting your sails to deal with changing winds, right?
I get it. You become more responsive in the long run, able to handle whatever comes your way?
Precisely. It's all about building adaptability.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here. But, and I bet some folks are thinking the same thing, doesn't too much variation mean you might learn to do something the wrong way?
It's a valid concern, for sure. The key is that the variation has to stay within the biomechanically sound possibilities of the skill.
So you're not just flailing around randomly, you're exploring different options within the correct technique.
Right. You're not going completely off the rails. It's like exploring different paths, but they all lead to the same destination.
I like that analogy, and this really challenges that whole idea of the perfect technique, doesn't it?
Definitely. Professor Schulhorn really emphasizes that we all have different bodies, strengths, weaknesses. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And he even mentioned a study where they analyzed black belt karatekas doing the same kick hundreds of times.
Oh, yeah, the 𝗏𝗏𝗃 kick.
Right. And even at that elite level, there was still a lot of variation in their movements.
Exactly. It's not about eliminating variation altogether. It's a natural part of how we move and learn. Each person finds what works best for them within the broader framework.
Okay, so let's get practical. How would someone actually use differential learning in training? Say, for example, in martial arts.
Let's take the gakuzuki, or reverse punch. That's a common one. Traditional training, you drill that punch the exact same way hundreds of times.
Right, trying to perfect that form.
But with differential learning, you'd mix it up. Change the angle, the target, maybe add some footwork, just introduce some variations.
So it's about being able to adapt to different situations.
Exactly. Because in a real fight, things are rarely perfect, right?
Yeah.
There are obstacles, your opponent is moving, you need to be able to adjust on the fly.
Makes sense. You're not just memorizing a script, you're learning to improvise.
And there's research showing that even in a seemingly simple technique like that, the gakuzuki, there's natural variation in how people do it.
Like how they rotate their hips or position their elbow.
Yeah, stuff like that. Our bodies naturally find those little variations that work best for us.
It's like we're fine-tuning our movements without even realizing it.
That's the beauty of it. You're not forcing your body into a rigid mold. You're letting it explore and discover.
This has been eye-opening so far. But I'm curious how this applies to, really high-pressure scenarios like police training, where split-second decisions can be life or death. Could you see differential learning being used in something like shoot, move, and communicate drills?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's even more important in those situations, because Professor Schulhorn's research shows that exposing people to a range of unpredictable situations actually improves their decision-making under pressure.
So instead of training in a perfectly controlled environment, you'd want to add some chaos, like moving targets, obstacles, distractions.
Exactly. You're creating instability in training so they learn to handle the unexpected in the real world.
This reminds me of how Professor Schulhorn talks about problem-based learning, right?
Yes, you want people to become problem solvers, not just rule followers.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, another question that comes to mind is, how does this work with teams, where everyone needs to be in sync, like a synchronized swimming routine or a football play?
That's a great question, and it highlights an important distinction. In training, variation is key for individual development. But when it comes to competition, you obviously need a certain level of coordination and shared understanding for the team to function.
So you wouldn't want everyone improvising during a big game.
Right, but even in team settings, differential learning is still super valuable in the training phase. Professor Schulhorn actually worked with rowing teams.
And rowing requires incredible synchronization, right?
Absolutely. And he would introduce variations into their training, like changing up the rhythm or throwing in unexpected challenges.
Interesting. So it's about using those variations to strengthen communication and coordination, even if the end goal is perfect synchronization in the actual competition.
Exactly. By training with those variations, the team develops a deeper understanding of each other's strengths, weaknesses, communication styles.
It builds trust and resilience, right?
Yeah. They build what's called shared mental models, which are crucial for any team that has to perform under pressure.
So it's using a bit of controlled chaos to create a more adaptable and resilient team. That's really cool. And it's not just limited to physical skills either, right?
Not at all. Professor Schulhorn's work extends to music, handwriting, even emotional regulation. He's found links to practices like meditation, qigong, yoga.
Wow, those seem like pretty different worlds.
They might look different on the surface, but they all involve varied movements, mindfulness, a focus on being present.
And he thinks they actually achieve similar brain states to what you see with differential learning.
That's what the research suggests. It's like there are multiple pathways to get to that state of enhanced learning, focus, and adaptability.
So whether you're pushing your limits physically or finding stillness through meditation, you're tapping into those same powerful brain mechanisms.
That's the idea, and it has huge implications for how we think about personal growth and well-being in general.
This has been a lot to take in. Let's pause here for a moment, and when we come back, we'll dig into some of Professor Schulhorn's key insights and how we can actually start applying these principles in our own lives.
Sounds good. There's a lot more to explore here, and I think it's going to be really helpful for everyone listening.
Okay, we're back, and ready to explore even more of this differential learning stuff. Before the break, we were talking about how it can be applied to pretty much anything: sports, music, even meditation. But I'm curious, why do you think we got so stuck in this rut of just doing the same thing over and over in the first place?
Well, Professor Schulhorn actually traces it back to, like, ancient military training, where conformity was everything. You know, if you need an army to move as one, you don't want everyone experimenting.
Right, you need everyone to follow orders.
Exactly. But the problem is that one-size-fits-all approach completely ignores the fact that we're all different.
Different bodies, different learning styles.
Right. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Makes sense. And he also brought up a really interesting point about how the dominance of Anglo-Saxon research might have contributed to this narrow view of motor learning.
Yeah, he contrasted it with Eastern traditions, where individuality and adaptation are often emphasized. Think about something like Kung Fu, with all its different styles.
Or Tai Chi, with that flowing movement.
It's a good reminder that there's not always just one right way to do things.
For sure. And Professor Schulhorn's own journey is a great example of that, right? He brought together all this knowledge from biomechanics, neurophysiology,
Even pedagogy.
to develop this whole new approach to learning.
He wasn't afraid to think outside the box.
And he didn't stop there. He even went on to explore how differential learning connects to practices like meditation, qigong, yoga.
I know, right? At first glance, those seemed like completely different worlds.
Totally. So how did he make that connection?
What he found was that while they might look different on the surface, they all involve these varied movements, mindfulness, being present in the moment.
And he believes they actually lead to similar brain states as differential learning.
Yeah, that's the idea. It suggests that maybe there are many different ways to unlock those states of enhanced learning and focus.
So whether you're pushing your limits in a workout or finding stillness in meditation, you're actually tapping into the same underlying brain mechanisms.
Pretty cool, huh? And it has huge implications for how we think about personal growth and well-being.
Now, Professor Schulhorn also talked about the importance of language and communication in differential learning.
Oh yeah, he had some interesting thoughts about that.
He seems to believe in using more varied language when instructing people, instead of just giving the same rigid commands over and over.
It's about recognizing that everyone learns differently, right? Some people respond better to visual cues, others to kinesthetic feedback. Some need a more analytical explanation.
So it's tailoring your communication to the individual.
Exactly. And remember that example he gave about offering multiple instructions for achieving the same movement.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating.
It gives people the freedom to choose what resonates with them and take ownership of their learning.
Instead of just blindly following orders.
Right. And that's especially important in teams. Understanding individual differences is key to building a really strong unit.
Professor Schulhorn actually shared how he used these principles to improve teamwork in rowing teams.
Oh yeah, he deliberately introduced unexpected challenges during their practice, like changing the rhythm or adding obstacles.
So they had to adapt and communicate on the fly.
Exactly. It forced them to work together as a unit.
And build those shared mental models we were talking about earlier.
Those are crucial for any team that has to perform under pressure, whether it's athletes, surgeons, first responders, you name it.
It's really about fostering a culture of adaptability and support.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that idea of challenging those old notions of control and conformity.
That Professor Schulhorn talks about.
His work is all about embracing uncertainty, exploring the unknown, trusting our ability to adapt.
It's a reminder that the most powerful learning often happens when we step outside of our comfort zones.
And make mistakes along the way.
Sometimes those mistakes lead to the most unexpected discoveries.
Absolutely. He even shared his own story about recovering from a serious injury. He tore his bicep.
Ouch.
And doctors told him he might never regain full function. But he proved them wrong.
Wow, that's incredible.
He used movement and alternative approaches to heal himself.
It's a testament to the amazing power of the human body to adapt and heal.
It's a good reminder that we're capable of much more than we often give ourselves credit for.
So what are some practical ways we can start applying these principles in our own lives?
Well, Professor Schulhorn really emphasizes the importance of thinking for yourself before reaching for external information.
Yeah, that was a really interesting point.
He said that relying too heavily on external information can actually stifle creativity.
It's like we've become so used to having Google answer all our questions.
That we've forgotten how to think for ourselves.
He even suggested that spending too much time on things like crossword puzzles or Sudoku might not be the best use of our brain power.
Because they train us to follow patterns instead of breaking them.
And in a world that's changing so rapidly, we need to be able to adapt, right?
Absolutely. So instead of immediately looking for the answer, he encourages us to try and solve problems on our own first.
To experiment, make mistakes, and learn from those experiences.
And who knows, you might just discover something amazing that you wouldn't have found otherwise.
His own research is a perfect example of that. He didn't let the prevailing dogma hold him back.
He challenged assumptions and created something truly groundbreaking.
It's inspiring to see how one person's curiosity can have such a huge impact.
And that's the message we want to leave you with today. Don't be afraid to question, explore, and forge your own path.
Embrace variation, challenge your beliefs, and trust in your ability to adapt and grow.
And remember, if someone tells you it's not possible,
Just say.
okay, now let's try.
It's interesting, isn't it? We often think of learning as this straight line, A to B, but the more we look at Professor Schulhorn's work, the more it seems like learning is more, well, messy.
Yeah, more like a jungle gym, he said. You're not just climbing a ladder, you're exploring all these different paths, making connections.
I really like that analogy. It captures the whole spirit of differential learning, right? There's no one right way to do things. You got to embrace those detours.
That's where the real learning happens, when you step outside that comfort zone, get a little uncomfortable.
Absolutely. He even talked about how this applies to things like emotional regulation, dealing with stress.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating.
The idea that exposing yourself to controlled amounts of stress, some variation in your routine, can actually make you more resilient in the long run.
It was like if you never lift anything heavy, your muscles won't get stronger. Same with our minds. We got to challenge ourselves a bit.
And that ties in with his advice about not being too reliant on external information, right?
Right. Like, we're so used to having Google at our fingertips, we've forgotten how to think for ourselves sometimes.
It's true. He even suggested that spending too much time on those brain games, like Sudoku, might actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, because you're just training your brain to follow patterns, not to break them.
And in a world that's constantly changing, that's not going to cut it.
Nope. So instead of immediately searching for the answer, try and solve the problem yourself first. Wrestle with it a bit.
Experiment, make mistakes. That's how we learn.
Professor Schoellhorn is a great example of that. He didn't let the dogma hold him back. He challenged the assumptions, came up with something totally new.
And it's changing the way we think about learning.
So what about you? What's one thing you're going to try differently after learning all this?
Well, I've always been a stickler for recipes when I cook, follow them to the letter. But I think I'm going to start experimenting a bit more, adding my own twist.
I like it. What about you?
I'm going to try to be more mindful of when I'm reaching for Google too quickly, sit with the problem a little longer, see if I can figure it out myself.
Those are great examples. It's those little shifts that can make a big difference.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. Hopefully, this deep dive into differential learning has sparked some new ideas.
And inspired you to embrace a little more variation in your life.
And remember, if someone tells you something's not possible, well, you know what to say.
Okay, now let's try.
That's it for this episode of the Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time.